The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the electricity was shut off. Nora Vásquez stood in the hallway of her apartment with the envelope in one hand and a flashlight in the other, the beam cutting a pale stripe across the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the October rain was hammering the streets of Fresno with the kind of indifference that only autumn rain has, the kind that doesn't care what it ruins. Inside, the apartment smelled of damp laundry and leftover rice, and somewhere in the back bedroom, her 9-year-old daughter Lily was doing homework by the glow of a battery-powered lantern she'd propped against a stack of library books. Nora set the flashlight on the kitchen counter so it aimed at the ceiling and created a dim, borrowed light. She was 34 years old, though the last 2 years had pressed something older into her face. Not wrinkles exactly, but a kind of weight behind the eyes, a density, the look of a woman who has learned that hope is not free, and that the price is paid quietly, in increments, over long, sleepless nights when the children are asleep and the silence becomes its own kind of noise. She looked at the envelope. Her name was written in a careful, formal script. Return address from a law office in Bakersfield. The name on the corner meant nothing to her at first. Whitmore and Associates, probate, and estate law. She had to read it twice before the word probate reached her brain and did what it was supposed to do. She sat down at the kitchen table in her coat because the heat had been running low on the same account as the electricity, and opened the envelope slowly. The way you open things when you're not sure whether what's inside will save you or finish you. It took her 3 readings to understand what the letter said. Her great-aunt Cecilia, a woman Nora had met exactly once as a small child and barely remembered, had died at the age of 91 in a town called Arvin, 40 miles south of Bakersfield. Cecilia had no children of her own. She had never married after a certain point, had lived alone for decades in a property described in the letter as a rural residence with outbuildings, approximately 4 acres, parcel number attached. And in the absence of any closer surviving relative, Nora had been named as heir. There was also a note in the letter about an item of personal property, specifically described as one sealed wooden crate, origin unknown, some dimensions approximately 4 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, currently held in the possession of the law office pending transfer. The note said the crate had been found in a locked room at the back of the property during the estate inventory. It had not been opened. A handwritten card attached to its exterior, in what the attorney described as Miss Cecilia's own writing, said only this: "For the family. Do not open until it reaches the right hands. 1943. Nora read that part again in the dim light. 1943. She was quiet for a long time. The rain kept falling outside. From the back bedroom, Lily called out that she'd finished her math and wanted to know if there was any more peanut butter. Nora folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and held it against her chest with both hands. She closed her eyes and breathed. Well, not with relief. Not yet. But with something that hadn't lived in her chest for a while, a small and careful thing, barely the size of a seed, that felt nevertheless like the beginning of something. She called out to Lily that yes, there was peanut butter on the second shelf, and that tomorrow they were going to take a drive. People would later ask Nora when exactly she knew her life was going to change, and she would always pause before answering, because the honest truth was complicated. She hadn't known. Not that first night. Not when she told her sister-in-law Renata about the inheritance, and Renata had laughed the way you laugh when someone tells you they're planning to win the lottery. Well, not when she drove down to Bakersfield 3 days later, with Lily in the passenger seat and $3.40 worth of gas station snacks between them, the old Civic making its familiar grinding complaint every time she shifted into fourth. The attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Whitmore, who wore a tie with small anchors on it, had explained the situation with the careful gentleness of someone who had learned that delivering good news and bad news often happened in the same meeting. The property, he said, was hers. Legally, cleanly, documented. The house had not been maintained well for the last decade or so, as Miss Cecilia's health had declined, and she'd been living primarily with a caretaker in town during her final years. He described the roof condition as concerning, the plumbing as unreliable, and the general state of the outbuildings as he paused and chose the word rustic. There were some back taxes owed, not devastating, but real. Nora would need to address those within 90 days or risk complications with the title transfer. When she asked how much, he told her, and she looked at the number written on the paper he slid across the desk and felt the small seed in her chest shrink slightly, though it did not disappear. The crate was brought in by a young paralegal on a dolly. It was heavier than it looked. The wood was dark, old-growth pine by the look of it, with iron hardware at the corners that had gone a deep reddish brown. A wax seal held the hasp closed, cracked now with age, but still roughly intact. Stenciled on one side in faded black paint were the letters USWD and a serial number she couldn't parse. On the lid, affixed with a small tack, was the card Whitmore had mentioned. Index card stock, slightly yellowed. The handwriting was small and precise. For the family. Do not open until it reaches the right hands. 1943. Lily had come around the desk to stand beside her mother and look at it. She reached out and touched the wood with one finger, the way children touch things in museums, carefully, with the tips. "What's inside?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Nora said. "Can we open it?" Nora looked at the attorney. He nodded. "It's yours to do with as you see fit." But Nora found herself hesitating. There was something about the card, the handwriting, the year. She felt, irrationally, that opening it here in a law office under fluorescent lighting, with a paralegal watching from the doorway, was not the right moment. Whatever her great-aunt had meant by the right hands, she didn't think she meant this room. "Not yet," she said. To Lily, and also to herself. They loaded the crate into the back of the Civic with the rear seats folded down. It fit, barely, and the car sat visibly lower on its suspension all the way home. The property in Arvin was everything Gerald Whitmore had implied, and nothing he had said out loud. Nora drove out to see it the following Saturday, again with Lily, this time also with her friend Dolores, who worked the same hotel housekeeping shift Nora had been laid off from 8 months ago, and who had a habit of saying exactly what she was thinking, regardless of whether it was helpful. The house sat at the end of a dirt road that had once been graded, but had long since reverted to its own preferences. Scrub oak lined the fence line. Shows a rusted gate hung open at a permanent angle, its hinge long past working. The house itself was a single-story structure of wood and stucco that had been, at some point in its history, white. Now it was the color of old newspapers. The porch sagged in the middle. One of the front windows had been covered from the inside with cardboard. Dolores got out of the car, looked at the house for a long moment and said, "Mija." "No." Nora got out and looked at it too. She had been bracing herself. She had known it wouldn't be good. But standing in front of it in the October morning light, the fog still sitting low over the Central Valley fields that stretched away behind the property, she felt a complicated thing move through her. Not despair exactly. Something less clean than despair. A kind of reckoning. She thought about her apartment in Fresno. The mold behind the bathroom tile she'd reported 3 times. The neighbor who played bass-heavy music until 2 in the morning. The way Lily had stopped asking for things because she'd learned, at 9 years old, that asking created a look on her mother's face that she didn't like to cause. She thought about the electricity bill, the back rent that had crept to a number she couldn't say out loud yet. The job applications that went nowhere or went to interviews where she sat in plastic chairs and smiled at people who would email her 3 days later to say they'd decided to pursue other candidates. She thought about all of that, and then she looked at the house again, and what she thought was, "It's mine." "It needs work," she said to Dolores. "It needs a priest," Dolores said. But Lily had already walked ahead to the porch and was peering through the cardboard-covered window. "Mom," she called back, "there's a barn?" There was a barn, behind the house and to the left, half hidden by a stand of eucalyptus that had grown tall and wild over the years. It was in somewhat better shape than the house, the walls solid if weathered, the roof missing only a few boards at the far end. Beyond it were 2 smaller outbuildings, one collapsing gently into itself, one still standing with some dignity. Nora walked the property that morning while Dolores sat on the porch steps and made her skepticism known in periodic installments. She walked the fence line, which was intact on 3 sides and mostly intact on the 4th. She walked through the barn, which smelled of old hay and machine oil and something else, for a faint metallic sweetness she couldn't identify. She walked through the house, which was dim and smelled of closed rooms and mice, but was structurally sounder than it appeared from outside. She found the locked room at the back, the one Whitmore had mentioned. It was off the kitchen, a narrow door with a padlock that the attorney had included a key for in the envelope. She opened it and stood in the doorway. It was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, with shelves along one wall that held glass jars, old tools, and several cardboard boxes gone soft with age. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling. No window. The floor was swept clean relative to the rest of the house, as if someone had taken care with this room specifically. On the shelf at eye level, she found a photograph she almost missed. It was tucked behind a jar that held what appeared to be dried herbs or seeds, leaning against the wall, as though placed there deliberately. The photograph was black and white, the paper thick and slightly warped. It showed 2 women standing in front of this house. She recognized the porch, in what appeared to be summer, given their light clothing. They were young, early 20s perhaps. One of them was laughing at something off camera. The other was looking directly at the lens with a steady, composed expression that Nora felt, with a small shock of recognition, was familiar. She couldn't have said why. The shape of the jaw, maybe. The set of the eyes. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful small handwriting as the card on the crate. Cecilia and Rosa. Arvin. Summer 1943. Nora stood in that small room for a long time, for looking at the photograph. Rosa had been her grandmother's name. Her grandmother, who had died before Nora was born, who existed in family memory only as a few stories told around holiday tables, as a woman who had come up from the fields, who had worked hard all her life and raised her children alone after her husband died young, a woman whose name Nora had been given as a middle name, Nora Rosa Vásquez, though she'd rarely used it. She was looking at her grandmother, young and laughing in the summer sun in 1943, standing in front of a house that now, 80-some years later, belonged to Nora. The phone call from her sister-in-law Renata came that evening because Renata always seemed to know when Nora was feeling something and found it necessary to immediately temper it. "I heard you went out to see the property," Renata said. In the tone she used for things she considered questionable life choices. Renata was married to Nora's brother Marco, who worked in insurance and liked to describe himself as practical. "I did," Nora said. "And?" "It needs some repairs." Nora. A pause. "Marco talked to someone, a contractor friend of his. He said places like that out in Arvin, agricultural zone, deferred maintenance, you're looking at maybe 40, 50,000 to make it livable. You don't have 40, 50,000. I know what I have, Renata. There are back taxes. I'm aware. And you're thinking about moving there. It wasn't quite a question. Nora was quiet for a moment. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment with her back against the couch, because the couch had a spring that had been working its way through the cushion for 6 months, and she'd learned to avoid the left side. The crate sat against the wall across from her. She'd been looking at it all evening. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I own land. For the first time in my life, I own something, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with it." "You could sell it," Renata said. "Even in that condition, it's 4 acres. You'd get something. Maybe. Marco says you should talk to a realtor. Get a number. At least know what it's worth before you make any decisions." "That's a reasonable thing to do," Nora agreed, in the voice she used when she had already made a different decision and wasn't ready to explain it yet. After she hung up, so she sat for another hour looking at the crate, the wax seal, the stenciled letters, the small card in her grandmother's best friend's handwriting. She thought about 1943. She was not a historian, but she knew enough. The war, the internment camps for Japanese Americans, the bracero workers in the California fields, her grandmother's people among them, the factories running day and night, the sense, which she'd read about and sometimes thought she could still feel as a kind of residue in the world, of a moment when everything was at stake and people did extraordinary things in secret because there was no other way to do them. What does a 20-year-old woman in Arvin in 1943 seal in a crate and mark for the family? She didn't know, but she knew she was going to find out. And she knew, with a quiet certainty that surprised her with its solidity, that she was going to do it on the land where the crate had waited. Not in this apartment. Not in this city. On that land, in that house, with the sagging porch and the cardboard window, on the 4 acres that the world had forgotten about and left for her. She went and got Lily from her room, where she was reading with the good flashlight they saved for important things, and she sat on the edge of the bed and said, "How would you feel about an adventure?" Lily looked at her over the top of her book with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who is both skeptical and desperately hoping for something good. "What kind?" she asked. "The kind where we fix up a house," Nora said, "and figure out a mystery." Lily lowered the book slowly. Is there actually a mystery?" Nora thought about the crate, the card, the photograph, the year. "I think so," she said. "I think someone left one for us." They moved to Arvin 6 weeks later, on a gray December morning, when the fields on either side of the highway lay bare and black under a low sky. Nora had gotten 3 months behind on her rent, forgiven in exchange for leaving quickly, a negotiation she'd conducted with the dignity of someone who understood that some victories are invisible. She'd sold what furniture she couldn't fit in the Civic and a borrowed pickup truck. She'd withdrawn the last of what was in savings, which was not much, but was something. Marco had not helped with the move. He and Renata had come by the night before to say goodbye. And Marco had stood in the empty apartment with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man attending a poorly advised expedition, and said, "You know you can always call if things go sideways." "I know," Nora said. "The house isn't habitable, Nora, not technically. We'll manage. You have a 9-year-old. I'm aware, Marco." He'd looked at the crate, still sitting against the wall, and his expression shifted to something she recognized as the thing he did when he was curious but didn't want to show it. "You still haven't opened that thing?" "Not yet." "Why not?" She didn't have an answer that would make sense to him. She'd tried a few times to articulate it, to Dolores, to herself in the car on long drives, and the best she could come up with was something about waiting for the right place, that the crate had waited 80 years, that a few more weeks were not going to hurt it, that she wanted to open it when she was on solid ground, even if that ground needed work. Marco had shrugged in the way he shrugged at things he'd decided not to argue about, and they'd embraced, and he'd pressed some cash into her hand before he left, which she accepted without comment because they both knew she needed it. Dolores helped with the actual moving. She arrived with her boyfriend's truck and a box of tamales her mother had made, and an air of cheerful doom that Nora found oddly comforting. "If this is a terrible idea," Dolores said, navigating the Civic's contents into the truck bed with impressive efficiency, "at least it's a story." "It's not a terrible idea," Nora said. "The roof, 3 sections need patching. I priced it out. I can do 2 of them myself with materials." Dolores looked at her. "You can?" "I watched 14 hours of YouTube videos." "That's..." Dolores paused. "Actually, that's kind of impressive." The first night in the house was hard in the specific way that first nights in challenging circumstances are hard, which is that everything that needs doing presents itself to you simultaneously at 2 in the morning when there is nothing you can do about any of it. The water ran, which was a mercy. The heat, such as it was, came from a propane heater she'd bought used and set up in the main room. The bedroom she'd cleared for Lily had a window that sealed properly and smelled acceptable after she'd scrubbed it down. But Nora slept on a sleeping pad in the living room and lay awake listening to the house settle and the wind move through the eucalyptus outside and the very distant sound of something agricultural operating in the fields to the north. She did not feel afraid. That surprised her. She had expected to feel afraid, and instead felt something she would later try to describe to Dolores as purposeful, which was a strange word for lying on a sleeping pad in a cold house in the Central Valley dark. But there it was. In the morning, she made coffee on the camp stove, and Lily came out in her pajamas and her wool socks and looked at the house in the morning light, which came through the windows at a low December angle, and caught the dust motes drifting in the air and made them look, briefly, like something intentional, but like something that had been arranged. "It's kind of beautiful," Lily said, with the honesty of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by noticing beauty in unlikely places. Nora looked at her daughter, standing in the pale winter light in the house that 80 years of living had not quite claimed, and felt the small seed in her chest open another fraction. "It is," she said. The people of Arvin did not exactly laugh at her, but they had their version of it. The town was small, tight-knit in the way of agricultural communities, organized around its rhythms of planting and harvest and the economics that governed both. People were not unfriendly, but they were watchful, particularly of a woman who showed up from the city with a child and a plan to fix up the old Reyes property, which was what they called it, so after the family that had owned it before the Cecilia years. As if Cecilia herself had only been a temporary custodian of something that had its own name, its own established place in the community's understanding of itself. There was a hardware store on the main street, owned by a man named Dale Hutchins, who had opinions about everything, and delivered them with the kind of certainty that comes from having lived in the same town for 60 years and never having been seriously wrong about anything local. He was not unkind to Nora when she came in for supplies, but he had a way of looking at her purchases that communicated something. The first time she came in for roofing materials, he looked at her list and then at her and said, "You doing this yourself?" "Yes," she said. He said, "I'm in the tone of a man who has seen many things not work out." The women at the school where she enrolled Lily were pleasant in a surface way that contained, beneath its pleasantness, a quality she recognized as assessment. She was being evaluated. Her hair, her car, her accent, her plans. She had grown up being evaluated, and she knew how to carry it without letting it show. But it was her neighbor to the north, a rancher named Bill Okafor, who ran a small beef operation on the adjacent land, who was the most direct. He drove his truck to her fence line one afternoon in late December, about 2 weeks after she'd moved in, and leaned out the window and said, "You the one that inherited the Reyes place?" "That's me," she said. She was on the roof at the time, which she reflected probably made a certain kind of statement. He looked at the roof, and then at her, then at the property in general. "That place has been empty going on 7 years," he said. "Cecilia stopped coming out regular after her hip went." "I know. I'm working on it." He was quiet for a moment. He was a large man, probably 60, with the weathered unhurriedness of someone whose relationship with time had been shaped by the needs of livestock. "You got family coming to help?" "Not exactly," she said. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that isn't agreement, but is a form of processing. "Water line to that property runs along the east fence," he said. "There's a joint connection for the old irrigation system. Last owner before Cecilia put it in. You'll want to check that before spring." "Thank you," she said. He nodded again. "Put the truck in gear." Then paused. "What are you planning to do with the place?" It was a question she'd been asked in various forms, and she'd been giving careful and abbreviated answers. But something about the directness of the way he asked it made her answer more fully. "Live in it," she said. "Fix it up, and figure out what's in the crate." He looked at her. "What crate?" "The one that's been locked in the back room for 80 years, she said. "The one my great-aunt didn't open, and her note says it's been there since 1943. He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Curiosity, she thought. Real curiosity. The kind that takes a person by surprise. He said. Not the same as Dale Hutchins. This one meant something different. He drove away. But 2 days later, he came back with his daughter Amara, who was studying history at Cal State and happened to be home for the semester break, and the three of them stood in the front room with the crate and talked for an hour about the Central Valley in the 1940s, while Lily listened from the kitchen doorway, with her chin resting on her arms on the counter. That conversation would matter later. But at the time, Nora noted only that it was the first moment since she'd arrived, that she felt like she might not be entirely alone in this. The work of those first weeks was physical, in the way that only survival-level repairs can be. Comprehensive, unglamorous, and occasionally frightening. She patched 2 sections of the roof herself, working in the cold mornings when the frost had just lifted, balanced on boards she'd laid across the joists. She fixed the kitchen plumbing with parts from Dale's hardware store, and a video she watched 4 times on her phone while kneeling under the sink. She cleaned the house from ceiling to baseboards, with the focused intensity of someone who has understood that cleanliness in a difficult situation is not a luxury, but a form of control. She enrolled Lily in the school, which was small, and immediately interested in Lily, in the way small schools are interested in new children, as a novelty that could become a community asset if treated correctly. Lily, who had her mother's capacity for adaptation and her grandmother Rosa's apparently genetic directness, made 2 friends in the first week. Money was the constant undertow. Nora had calculated carefully, the way people calculate when there is very little margin for error. The back taxes on the property had been the largest immediate obstacle. She'd managed them through a combination of the cash Marco had given her, the small inheritance check that had accompanied the property transfer, and a payment plan the county office had agreed to with a minimum of difficulty. She was not comfortable. She was not stable. But she was, for the moment, moving forward. She took on cleaning jobs in town, 3 houses plus a small commercial space, work she'd been doing in various forms for most of her adult life. It paid enough, in combination with the food assistance she qualified for, to keep them in groceries and propane and school supplies and the steady stream of small hardware purchases the house demanded. She did not open the crate. She had moved it to the back room, the locked room where she'd found the photograph. When she'd cleaned the room, and put up a shelf light so she could see it properly. She visited it sometimes in the evenings, when Lily was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, and she sat in the old wooden chair she'd brought in from the barn and looked at it and thought. The thinking was not idle. She had begun to research, quietly and systematically, in the hours after Lily was in bed. The library in the nearest larger town had a local history section. She'd found records of the Arvin agricultural labor camp from the 1940s, where many families like her grandmother's had lived and worked. She'd found references to the wartime economy of the Central Valley, the crops that had been grown for the war effort, the workers who had come from Mexico under the Bracero program and who had often lived in conditions that the historical record described with careful academic distance, but that Nora read and felt in her blood. She'd found, in a scanned copy of a regional newspaper from 1943, a brief article about a community effort organized in several Central Valley towns to collect and safeguard items of cultural and personal value for families whose men had been drafted or whose living situations were precarious. The article described the effort as, and she read this phrase several times, a preservation project organized by women of the farming communities, operating largely without institutional support. The article mentioned no names, but the town listed was Arvin, and the date was June 1943, the same summer as the photograph on the shelf, Cecilia and Rosa, standing in front of this house, laughing and not laughing. Nora sat with this for a long time. She thought about what a 22-year-old woman in 1943 might have considered worth preserving, worth sealing in a crate and marking with the words for the family and trust it to time. She thought about what it meant to hide something not out of shame, but out of care, out of the knowledge that the world was not safe and that some things had to be protected until the right moment, the right hands. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who she had never known, who had worked in these fields and raised her children and died before Nora was born, who had laughed in a summer photograph, and then, as far as the family record was concerned, and simply lived and worked and endured and disappeared into the ordinary heroism of surviving. What had Rosa and Cecilia preserved? What had they decided was worth 80 years of waiting? It was Amara Okafor, the rancher's daughter, who first suggested that the stenciled letters on the crate might be traceable. She'd come by on a Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a jar of her father's pickled peppers that he'd sent without explanation, and had ended up in the back room looking at the crate with her historian's eye. USWD, she read. That's an unusual stencil. She had her phone out. Can I photograph it? Nora said yes. I want to look into this. The lettering style, the hardware, the serial number, if it's a real one. That'll tell us what kind of crate it is. Military supply? Commercial shipping? Agricultural? She was already typing. The wax seal is interesting. See how it's done? That's a specific technique, not amateur. Someone who knew what they were doing. My great-aunt Cecilia worked in food preservation, Nora said, remembering something the attorney had mentioned. Before she retired. Amara looked up. Canning? Processing? I think so. Then she would have known how to seal things, how to create a long-term vacuum seal on a wooden container. That's not nothing. That's actually impressive. Keeping something intact for 80 years in a California summer climate. You'd need to really know what you were doing. Nora looked at the crate with new eyes. She'd been thinking of the seal as a symbol, an act of intention. Now she thought about it as a technical achievement. Cecilia had not just meant to preserve whatever was inside. She had succeeded in doing so across 8 decades of heat and cold and the indifferent passage of time. That felt significant in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. I'm not opening it until I understand what I'm dealing with, Nora said. It came out more firmly than she expected. Amara nodded, as if this were entirely rational. Good. Because if there's something inside that has historical or material value, you want documentation before you open it. You want a record of the chain of custody. You want witnesses. You want photographs of the exterior condition, the seal, the markings, all of it, before you break anything. Nora looked at her. You've thought about this, Amara smiled. I study the 1940s Central Valley as part of my thesis. A sealed crate from 1943 found on a labor community property in Arvin. This is not a small thing, Nora. Whatever's inside, the crate itself is a historical object. That night, after Amara had left and Lily was in bed, Nora sat in the back room for a long time. She looked at the crate. She looked at the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa, which she'd framed and put on the shelf across from it. Two young women in summer. Something determined in both their faces, visible even at this distance of decades. She thought about what it means to trust time, to believe that the future will hold what the present cannot safely carry. She thought about how she had driven down to Arvin with $3 in gas station snacks and a broken springed couch she hadn't been sorry to leave behind, and a daughter who had stopped asking for things, and how she had stood in front of this house in the October morning and thought, it's mine. She thought about the back taxes paid, the roof sections patched, the plumbing under the kitchen sink, the school where Lily had two friends now, and a teacher who had told Nora last week that her daughter had a remarkable quality of attention. She thought about all of this, and then she made herself a cup of tea on the camp stove and sat in the chair in the back room and talked to the photograph. She said, I don't know what you put in there, but I think you'd understand why I needed to get here first before I opened it. I think you'd understand that some things have to be prepared for. I think you knew that. I think that's actually the whole point. The house was quiet around her. The eucalyptus moved in the wind outside. Since somewhere across the fields, a coyote called once and was answered. And then the night was still again. Nora sat with her tea and the crate and the photograph and the year 1943 and all of the distance between that summer and this winter. And she felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the fields lay dark and cold and waiting. The same fields her grandmother had worked in, the same soil that had held all of this in trust for 80 years without knowing why. She was beginning to understand why. By February, the house was livable in a real sense, not just a technical one. She had replaced the cardboard in the front window with actual glass, as a second-hand pane she'd found at a salvage place in Bakersfield, and cut to size with a tool she'd borrowed from Bill Okafor, and returned with a plate of the rice and beans she made on Sundays. She'd painted the interior of the main room and the kitchen in a warm off-white that caught the light differently at different hours of the day. She'd repaired the porch, which had required pulling up 7 boards and sistering new wood alongside the joists that had been affected by moisture, a project that had taken her 2 weekends and left her with several new skills and a deep respect for whoever had originally built the porch, because the bones of it were genuinely solid. Lily had claimed the second bedroom, which had a window that looked out toward the barn, and had hung her drawings on the wall and put her books on a shelf Nora had made from salvaged timber and hardware store brackets. It looked like a room where someone lived. It looked like a home. The barn had become Nora's project in the evenings, after the housework slowed. It was structurally sound, better than the house in several ways, with a concrete floor that someone had poured at some point in its history, and drainage that still functioned. She'd been cleaning it out, slowly, working through the accumulated sediment of decades. It was in the barn that she found the second clue. She'd been clearing the back corner, which was dense with old feed sacks and broken equipment, and the kind of miscellaneous accumulation that happens when a space stops being actively used but isn't quite abandoned. Under a tarpaulin that had gone stiff and greenish with age, she found a wooden workbench, heavy and well-made. And on the underside of the bench's top surface, carved into the wood with what must have been a careful hand and a small blade, was a phrase in Spanish. Lo que guardamos vive. What we keep, lives. Nora crouched under the bench for a long time looking at it. The carving was neat, practiced, the letters well-formed, not recent. The wood had aged uniformly, the carved lines as darkened as everything else. Whoever had written this had done it a long time ago. She photographed it. She sent the photograph to Amara, who responded within minutes. Amara. This is significant. This is the kind of phrase that appears in community preservation literature from the 40s. Women's networks, cultural safeguarding. There's a whole historiography of this that has been mostly invisible until recently. Amara. Nora. I think your great-aunt and your grandmother were part of something organized, something deliberate. This wasn't just two women deciding to put things in a box. I think they were part of a network. Nora sat on the barn floor with her phone and looked at the carved words and thought about what it means to be part of something you don't yet have a name for. Lo que guardamos vive. She thought about the crate. She thought about the wax seal and the careful stenciling and the note with its precise, small handwriting. She thought about Cecilia, 91 years old, and living with a caretaker in town, choosing not to open it, choosing to wait for the family. Even as the decades accumulated and the family scattered and the property grew wild around the house that held the secret, choosing to trust that the right hands would come. Outside the barn, the February light was thin and cold, and the fields were beginning to show the first faint green of winter cover crops. Nora looked at it through the open barn door and thought about spring, about what the land might yield when it was properly tended, about what had been cured and preserved and trusted to time. She went inside and sat with Lily, and they ate dinner together in the kitchen of the house that was becoming their home. And Lily talked about a project she was doing at school on California history, which seemed, in the particular way that childhood has of being accidentally profound, exactly right. Did you know, Lily said, cutting her rice into sections the way she always did, that during World War II, a lot of families buried their important stuff because they were scared it would get taken away? Nora looked at her daughter. Where did you learn that? She asked. Ms. Reyes, Lily said. She's doing a unit on the home front. She said people hid jewelry and documents and family things because they didn't know what was going to happen. Nora said. Do you think Aunt Cecilia's crate is like that? Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about the carving on the workbench, the preservation network Amara had mentioned, the careful seal, the year. I think, she said slowly, that what's in that crate was put there by people who were protecting something they loved, during a time when the world felt very uncertain. Lily considered this. No, that's kind of like us, she said. Nora looked at her. Moving here, Lily said, when everything felt uncertain. We came here to protect something. What do you think we were protecting? Nora asked. Lily thought about it seriously, in the way she thought about things that mattered. Us, she said finally. Our future. Nora reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's. The kitchen was warm. The light was the particular amber of a winter evening settling in. Outside, the fields were quiet, and the eucalyptus stood dark against a sky going from gold to rose to gray. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. The crate waited in the back room. The wax seal held. The year 1943 persisted in the wood and the iron and the careful handwriting on the card. Lo que guardamos vive. Spring was coming. And with it, the moment that 80 years of careful keeping had been waiting for. The decision to open the crate did not come as a single moment of resolve. It came the way most important decisions come, gradually, assembled from smaller recognitions, until one morning she woke up and understood that she had already decided, had perhaps decided weeks ago, and what she'd been doing since was simply preparing herself to act on it. It was the second week of March. The almond orchards to the east had bloomed, and the air on certain mornings carried their scent across the fields, something between honey and chalk, delicate and strange. The cover crops were green and low along the furrows. The sky had begun to hold its light longer into the evening, that particular expansion of days that happens in late winter and always feels, no matter how many times you've lived through it, like a permission. Nora had been corresponding with Amara regularly through the winter. They had established a working rhythm, Amara researching from the university library and her own thesis sources, Nora providing details and photographs and the occasional artifact from the property, a glass jar label, a scrap of paper found in a drawer, the barn carving. Together, they had assembled something that looked, if not yet like a complete picture, at least like the outline of one. The stencil on the crate, USWD, had taken Amara 3 weeks to trace. It was not a military designation, as Nora had initially assumed, but a commercial one. United States Warehouse and Distribution, a network of agricultural logistics companies that had operated throughout California during the war years, that contracted by the government to move food products from the Central Valley farms to military supply chains. The crates had been standard issue, produced in large quantities, used to ship preserved goods. Cecilia, who had worked in food processing, would have had access to them. The serial number was partially traceable. The prefix matched a batch produced in 1942 and 1943 at a facility in Fresno. The suffix was consistent with crates distributed to the Arvin agricultural district. What Cecilia had done, Amara explained in an email that Nora read 3 times at the kitchen table, was use a familiar container, one that would not draw attention, one that looked like ordinary wartime commerce, to hide something that was not ordinary at all. She had used the infrastructure of the visible world to conceal the contents of the invisible one. It was, Amara wrote, a classic preservation technique of the period. Hide in plain sight. Make the container legible to authority and illegible to scrutiny. Nora had read this and thought about her grandmother Rosa laughing in the summer photograph. She had thought about what it means to be a young woman in 1943, working in the fields and the processing plants, watching the world reorganize itself around a war that had reached into every household, and deciding, with a friend, to protect something. Not loudly, not with documents or declarations, quietly with wax and wood and time. She had thought, I come from that. The realization had moved through her like something physical. She called Amara on a Thursday morning and told her she was ready. Amara said she'd be there Saturday. She said she was bringing her thesis advisor, a professor named Dr. Ellen Marsh, who specialized in California labor history and women's preservation networks of the wartime period, who had been following Amara's updates about the crate with what Amara described as barely contained professional excitement. She called Bill Okafor and told him what she was doing, and he said he'd come by, if that was all right. She said it was. She called Dolores, who drove down from Fresno on Friday night, and slept on the couch, and spent Saturday morning making breakfast for everyone with a cheerful efficiency that Nora found steadying. She did not call Marco and Renata. She would tell them afterward. She understood this about herself without judgment. On Saturday morning, the group assembled in the back room of the house in Arvin. Nora, Lily, Amara, Dr. Marsh, Bill Okafor, and Dolores, who stood in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder because she'd been washing the breakfast things and hadn't taken it off. Dr. Marsh was a small woman in her 60s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the composed alertness of someone who has spent decades training herself to notice things other people miss. She had brought a camera, not a phone, but a proper one, and she spent the first 15 minutes photographing every surface of the crate from every angle before anyone touched anything. She photographed the wax seal, which she described as a paraffin beeswax mixture consistent with domestic preservation practice of the 1940s. She photographed the stenciling and noted that the paint application suggested a careful hand and a proper stencil brush rather than a spray. So she photographed the iron hardware and estimated its age as consistent with the stated period. She photographed the card, the small index card with its careful handwriting, and she stood looking at it for a long moment before she said, quietly, almost to herself, she knew this would work. She knew it would last. "How can you tell?" Lily asked. She had been standing at the back of the room, very still, watching everything. Dr. Marsh looked at her. "Because the seal is overbuilt," she said. "She used more wax than she needed to. She double-sealed it. She was not taking chances. She intended this to survive." Lily nodded, the grave nod of someone absorbing information of consequence. When Dr. Marsh was satisfied with the photographic record, she stepped back and looked at Nora. "It's yours," she said, "whenever you're ready." Nora stood in front of the crate. The room was quiet. Outside, the morning was clear, and a blade of light came through the small window above the shelves and fell across the lid at an angle that caught the grain of the old wood and the dull gleam of the iron hardware. The photograph of Cecilia and Rosa was on the shelf across from it, where Nora had placed it in December. Two young women in summer, one laughing, one steady. She thought about everything that had led here. The letter on the Tuesday the electricity was shut off, the drive to Bakersfield with gas station snacks, the sagging porch, the 14 hours of roofing videos, the 3 months of back taxes, the carving on the underside of the workbench, her grandmother's face in a black and white photograph from 1943. Lily, who had stopped asking for things because she'd learned it caused a look on her mother's face. The look, Nora thought, that was not on her face today. She picked up the small pry bar she'd set on the shelf for this purpose, and she crouched in front of the crate, and she very carefully, very deliberately, broke the wax seal. The wax came away in segments, brittle with age but cohesive, the way something carefully made holds its shape even in dissolution. Nora worked slowly, following the seal around the perimeter of the lid, not forcing it, but coaxing it, the way she'd learned to coax things that had been closed a long time. When the last section released, she set the pry bar down and put both hands on the lid. The room was completely silent. She lifted it. The first thing she registered was the smell. Not decay, not must, not the expected odor of 80 years of sealed air. Something else. A faint and complicated scent, dry and resinous, with something beneath it that she couldn't immediately name, but that her body recognized before her mind did. Something old and preserved and strangely alive. The inside of the crate had been packed with extraordinary care. Layers of material she identified after a moment as oilcloth, the heavy waxed fabric used in the period for waterproofing, separated each layer of contents. The oilcloth had been folded and tucked with precision, every edge overlapping, every seam sealed with what appeared to be additional wax applied by hand. Dr. Marsh was at her shoulder now, camera clicking in a steady rhythm. Nora reached in and carefully lifted the first layer of oilcloth. Beneath it, wrapped individually in what had once been tissue paper, now fragile as old skin but still intact, were objects. The first thing her hands found was flat and rectangular. She lifted it, and the tissue fell away partly, and she saw a frame. Wood, dark, perhaps 4 inches by 5, and inside the frame, a painting. Small, oil on board, the colors still vivid despite everything. A landscape, or the suggestion of one. Ochre hills, a sky that was almost violet, a line of dark trees on the horizon. In the lower right corner, barely legible, a signature. 2 words in a compressed cursive she couldn't read at first. She tilted it toward the light. Her breath stopped. She read the name again. Then she looked up at Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh was looking at the signature too, through her reading glasses, leaning very close. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Something in her face had gone very still. "Amara," she said, without looking away from the painting. Her voice was even, professionally controlled, but with something beneath it that was neither even nor controlled. "Come look at this." Amara crossed the room and looked. Nora watched her face. "That can't be," Amara said. "We'll need authentication," Dr. Marsh said, "but the technique is consistent. The board, the size, the palette." She straightened and looked at Nora. "Do you know who this is?" Nora looked at the signature again. She shook her head. Dr. Marsh said a name. It was a name Nora did not recognize, but she would later, in the weeks and months that followed, come to know very well. A Mexican muralist and painter who had worked in California in the late 1930s and early 1940s, who had created a body of work that was now considered historically significant and largely scattered, much of it unaccounted for. A painter who had been known to give small studies and sketches to people in the communities where he worked, who had been in the Central Valley during the Bracero years, who had, based on the historical record, spent time in Arvin in 1942. "There are 11 paintings of his currently in major museum collections," Dr. Marsh said. Her voice had taken on the careful quality of someone thinking aloud, while also keeping themselves composed. "The last one that came to auction sold for $900,000. The room was very quiet. Nora was still holding the painting. She became aware of this and set it down with extreme care on the oilcloth, as though it were something living. She looked into the crate. Well, there was more. The oilcloth layers she now saw were numerous. Whatever Cecilia and Rosa had placed here, it was not only this. They worked for 4 hours. Dr. Marsh directed the process with the methodical calm of someone who understood that the value of what they were handling was not only monetary, and that rushing was not an option. Each item was photographed in situ before it was lifted. Each wrapping was removed carefully and preserved. Each object was documented, described, and set on the clean sheet they had spread across the floor of the room. The paintings numbered 7 in total. All small, all oil on board, or oil on paper, all bearing the same signature. All depicting scenes of the Central Valley, workers in fields, women at tables, children in doorways, landscapes of the agricultural communities that had been, like in that period, largely invisible to the broader world. Among them was one that stopped everyone. It was slightly larger than the others, perhaps 6 inches by 8, and it showed 2 women standing in front of a house. The house was this house, identifiable by the porch, the window placement, the particular angle of the roofline. The women were young, in summer clothing. One was laughing at something beyond the frame. The other was looking directly at the painter with a steady, composed expression. They were Cecilia and Rosa. Nora sat down on the floor when she understood what she was looking at. She sat down without planning to, simply because her legs made that decision for her. When she sat on the floor of the back room of the house that had been in her family's orbit for 80 years, and looked at a painting of her grandmother, made by a man whose work now sold for nearly $1 million, and she held the 2 things together in her mind, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the woman who had worked in the fields and the woman preserved in paint, and she could not have told anyone in that moment what she was feeling because it was too many things at once. Lily came and sat beside her on the floor. She didn't say anything. She just sat close, the way she'd learned to sit with her mother when her mother was dealing with something large. After a while, Nora put her arm around her daughter, and they sat together and looked at the painting of the two young women on the porch of the house that was now theirs. There was more in the crate. Beneath the paintings, in the middle layers, were documents. Bundles of them, tied with cloth tape that had dried and stiffened, but held. Dr. Marsh and Amara handled these together, unfolding them with the focused delicacy of surgeons. Some were personal papers, handwritten letters, a baptismal certificate in Spanish, a marriage record, documents that had belonged to families of the agricultural community, preserved here when those families had moved on or scattered, or feared that the disruptions of the wartime years might cost them the evidence of their own histories. Some families send their valuables ahead of disaster. Some bury them. Some seal them in crates and trust them to friends and to time. There were also, in a sealed inner box that had been wrapped in 3 layers of oilcloth and nested at the center of the crate like a heart, objects of a different kind. The box was cedar, small, fitted with a simple latch that opened without resistance. Inside, packed in cotton, wadding that had yellowed but done its job, were coins. Gold coins, 23 of them. American gold pieces, several different denominations, the dates on their faces ranging from 1898 to 1932. Even Nora, who knew nothing about numismatics, understood when she saw them that they were significant. Their surfaces were undimmed, protected by the cotton and the sealed box, and the oilcloth, and the crate, and the wax, and 80 years of Cecilia's faith. Bill Okafor, who had been standing quietly near the door for most of the morning, said, in a voice that was very careful and very level, "Those are double eagles." Dr. Marsh looked at him. $20 gold pieces, he said, before 1933, before Roosevelt called them in. He was quiet for a moment. "My father collected coins. He taught me." He looked at the coins in the cedar box, laid in their cotton like sleeping things. Pre-1933 American gold in that condition. He stopped. "What are they worth?" Dolores asked from the doorway. She had forgotten the dish towel entirely. Nobody answered immediately. The question sat in the room. Dr. Marsh said, carefully, "That depends on the specific pieces, their grades, their mint marks. It would require a professional assessment. But pre-1933 American gold coins, in uncirculated or near uncirculated condition, depending on the specific dates and mint marks." She paused. "But some of those dates are rare. The 1927 D, for instance, if that's what I'm seeing, is extremely rare in any condition." Amara had her phone out and was already searching. She looked up. She said a number. Not to alarm, but because she was a researcher, and numbers were how she understood things. The number she said was large enough that Dolores made a sound and put her hand over her mouth. Nora looked at the coins. She thought about who had put them there. She thought about a community of agricultural workers in 1943, many of them operating outside formal banking systems, many of them holding their wealth in physical form because they had good historical reasons not to trust institutions with it. She thought about a 22-year-old woman with access to industrial crates and knowledge of food preservation, and the steady eyes of someone who understood that the future was not guaranteed. She thought about trust, the specific and radical act of trusting the future with what the present cannot safely hold. "Lo que guardamos vive." She looked at Lily. Lily was looking at the coins with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered. After a moment, she looked up at her mother. "They saved these for us," she said. "Not a question, a statement of understanding." "For someone like us," Nora said. "Yes. They didn't know us. No, but they knew someone would come. Lily looked back at the coins. She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "That's like faith." The room was quiet for a moment. "Oh, yes," said Dr. Marsh softly. "That's exactly what it is." There was one more thing at the bottom of the crate. Nora found it herself, when everyone else had stepped back to allow her a moment with the emptying container. Her hands felt it before her eyes registered it. A flat object, wrapped more heavily than the others, triple layered in oilcloth, and then in a piece of canvas that had been sewn shut with careful stitches. She cut the stitches with a small knife and unwrapped it slowly. It was a book. Not printed, handwritten. A journal, or something between a journal and a ledger, filled in two different hands that alternated throughout its pages. The cover was plain dark cloth, slightly stiff, the spine reinforced with a strip of leather. On the inside front cover are written in the same careful small script as the card on the crate. For whoever finds this, this is what we kept, and why. Cecilia Reyes, 1943. The other hand, bolder and slightly less regular, had added below it in pencil, barely visible but legible when held to the light. "I lo que guardamos vive. Rosa." Nora held the book against her chest. She did not read it immediately. She would read it later, over several evenings, sitting in the kitchen with the lamp on and the house quiet around her, reading the words that two young women had written in 1943 about what they were preserving and for whom and why. Reading the names of families and the descriptions of objects and the careful record of a network that had operated in the margins of the visible world, doing the invisible work of keeping things alive. She would read about the painter who had come through Arvin in 1942 and spent 3 weeks working with the agricultural communities and had given paintings to families as thanks for their hospitality. Small studies and sketches made quickly in the mornings before the fieldwork began. She would read about how those families had entrusted the paintings to Cecilia when circumstances became uncertain, when movement became necessary, when the future felt like something that couldn't be relied upon. She would read about Rosa, her grandmother, who had helped gather and document and seal, who had contributed the coins from a cache that the journal described only as belonging to several families of the labor camp, who had chosen to pool their most portable wealth against the possibility of need. She would read Cecilia's precise descriptions of the sealing process, the wax mixture, the layering, the cedar box for the coins because cedar repels moisture and insects, the tissue for the paintings because they needed to breathe slightly within their oilcloth wrapping, the care, the extraordinary, quiet, absolute care of it. She would read the final entry, dated October 1943, in Cecilia's hand. "We have done what we can. The rest is time and trust, and whoever comes after us, who needs what we have kept. May they find it in better days." But that was later. On the Saturday morning in March, standing in the back room of the house in Arvin with the people who had gathered to witness this, she simply held the book and stood with everything it represented, pressing against her chest like a hand. Dr. Marsh was the first to speak. She spoke quietly, with the specific kind of precision that her professional training had built into her over decades. But beneath it, clearly, something personal and unguarded. "What you have here," she said, "is not only an inheritance, it's a historical collection. The paintings alone, if authenticated, would represent a significant scholarly discovery. Several works by this artist that have been considered lost for decades. The coins are a material history of a community's relationship with financial security in a period of profound instability. The documents are irreplaceable personal histories. And the journal," she paused. "The journal is the kind of primary source that historians spend careers hoping to find." Nora looked at her. "You should know," Dr. Marsh continued, that there will be interest in this. From museums, and from universities, from collectors. You have the right to make your own decisions about all of it. And I want to be clear that I am here as a witness and a resource, not as someone who has any claim on your choices. But you should know what you have. You should go into whatever comes next with full information. What do I have? Nora asked, not rhetorically, as a real question. Dr. Marsh thought for a moment. She was the kind of person who did not say numbers carelessly, who understood that numbers were not just quantities, but consequences. Conservatively, she said, with proper authentication, the paintings alone could represent several $1 million in value. The coins, depending on grading, potentially another significant sum, possibly more than the paintings. The documents and the journal have institutional value that is harder to quantify, but real. She paused. But I want to say something else, which is that value is not only monetary, and I suspect you know that. I know that, Nora said. The story of this crate, the network it represents, the women who made it, your grandmother among them, that story has value that money doesn't measure. What these women did in 1943 deserves to be known. The communities they protected deserve to have their histories visible. Nora nodded slowly. She was thinking about many things simultaneously. The way you think when the world has just rearranged itself around you, and you are trying to locate your footing in the new arrangement. She was thinking about the back taxes, paid, about the roof sections, patched, about the sleeping pad on the floor of the empty apartment in December, and the careful calculation of what remained in her savings, and whether it was enough to get to the next month. She was thinking about Lily, who had stopped asking for things. She was thinking about her grandmother Rosa, 22 years old in a summer photograph, laughing at something off frame, and the faith it took to seal something in a crate, and mark it for the family, and trust the future to deliver it to the right hands. She was thinking, the right hands. The afternoon passed in a kind of heightened stillness. Dr. Marsh made careful documentation of every object, cross-referencing her photographs with written notes in a small notebook she produced from her bag. Amara assisted, and her historian's instincts overriding her astonishment with increasing success as the hours went on. Bill Okafor made coffee in Nora's kitchen, without being asked, and brought cups to everyone, moving through the house with the unhurried practicality of a man who understands that useful action is its own form of witness. Dolores sat with Lily on the porch steps in the afternoon sun, their voices low and comfortable, and when Nora came out briefly to breathe the outside air and stand in the daylight for a moment, she heard Lily telling Dolores about the network of women, about what they had preserved, about the journal, speaking with the informed clarity of a 9-year-old who has been paying careful attention. So the crate was like a time capsule, Dolores said, but not for space junk and newspaper front pages, for the real stuff. For things that needed to be saved, Lily agreed, because the people who had them might not be safe to keep them. Your great-great-grandmother helped do that. My great-grandmother. Rosa. Lily said the name with the particular care of someone claiming it. She's the one in the painting. Dolores looked at Nora, who was leaning against the porch post listening. Something in Dolores's face opened into something Nora could not look at directly because it was too much like being seen. Your grandmother, Dolores said to Nora quietly, in a painting by someone whose work is worth $1 million. Several paintings, Nora said. The one with both of them, and probably others in the collection that we haven't identified yet. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, now in the voice she used when she was setting aside humor because the moment required it, Nora, do you understand what this is? I'm starting to, Nora said. You came here with nothing. You fixed this house with your hands and 14 hours of YouTube. You kept that crate sealed for months because you understood, somehow, that it needed the right moment. Dolores paused. And now, Nora agreed. They looked at the fields together. The afternoon light was long and gold across the cover crops. The almond scent had faded with the warmth of the day. Somewhere in the barn, a bird was making a periodic sound, methodical and unhurried. "What are you going to do?" Dolores asked. It was the question everyone would ask, in various forms, in the weeks that followed. Nora had been thinking about it since the moment the lid came off the crate, or perhaps since long before that, since the letter arrived on the Tuesday the electricity was shut off, since she stood in front of the house in October and thought, "It's mine." She did not have a complete answer yet, but she had the beginning of one. "First," she said, "I'm going to get proper authentication on everything. Dr. Marsh has already offered to connect me with conservation specialists she trusts. And then? And then I'm going to find out if any of those families are still traceable, the ones whose documents are in the crate, the ones who contributed the coins. This wasn't only Cecilia's collection. She was a custodian." Nora paused. "I want to understand what belongs where before I make any decisions about the rest." Dolores looked at her. "That's going to take time." "Yes, you could just—" "I know," Nora said, "but I came from people who took the time, who understood that some things are worth doing carefully." She looked at the photograph in her mind, the one on the shelf in the back room. Cecilia with her careful eyes, and Rosa with her open laugh. "I don't want to do this in a way they'd be ashamed of." Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Rosa would not be ashamed of you, whatever you do." Nora looked at the fields, at the land that was hers, 4 acres in the Central Valley, that the world had forgotten about and left in trust for 80 years. "No," she said. "I don't think she would." That evening, after everyone had gone, after Dr. Marsh had left with her camera full of documentation and a promise to begin the authentication process, after Amara had driven away with a list of sources to pursue and barely suppressed scholarly elation, after Bill Okafor had shaken Nora's hand at the fence line with the quiet gravity of a man who has witnessed something and knows it, after Dolores had hugged her in the kitchen for a long moment and driven back to Fresno, Nora and Lily were alone in the house. They made dinner together, the two of them moving around the kitchen with the easy coordination of people who have shared a small space for months and learned each other's rhythms. Lily set the table. Nora cooked. The house smelled of cumin and garlic and warm tortillas, and the evening light came through the window above the sink at a low angle and caught the steam from the pot. After dinner, Lily asked if they could look at the painting again, the one of Cecilia and Rosa. They went to the back room together. The objects from the crate had been carefully replaced in their oilcloth wrappings and set on the clean shelf Dr. Marsh had recommended, pending proper conservation storage. The paintings were laid flat, each documented and tagged. The cedar box with the coins was closed and wrapped. The journal sat separately, also wrapped, waiting. Nora unwrapped the painting of the two women carefully and held it where the light could reach it. She and Lily stood in the small room and looked at it together. Rosa, 22 years old, laughing at something beyond the edge of the world that had been captured here. Cecilia, steady-eyed and composed, looking at the painter with an expression that Nora now understood differently than she had before. Not just composure. Knowing. The expression of someone who is already thinking about what comes after this moment, about the future she intends to protect. "She looks like you," Lily said. Nora looked at Rosa's laughing face, the shape of the jaw, the line of the cheekbone. "You think?" "The way she's laughing. You laugh like that sometimes, when you forget to be serious. Nora looked at her daughter. You should do that more, Lily said, with the directness of a 9-year-old who has decided that this is an important thing to say. Forget to be serious. We're going to have more reasons to, Nora said. Lily thought about this. Because of the crate? Because of the crate. Because of what's in it. Because of what it means. She paused. Because we came here and we stayed. And we did the work, and we were the right hands. We were, Lily agreed, on without false modesty, because it was simply true. Nora wrapped the painting carefully and set it back. She turned off the shelf light, and they went back to the kitchen, where the dishes were waiting. They washed them together, Lily washing and Nora drying, the old radio on the windowsill playing something low and steady. The house was warm. The fields outside were dark and quiet. In the back room, the objects waited in their careful wrappings, patient as they had always been. 80 years of patience having apparently been sufficient preparation for a little more. Lo que guardamos vive. The authentication process took 11 weeks. Dr. Ellen Marsh was as good as her word and better. Within 10 days of the opening, she had connected Nora with a conservation specialist in Los Angeles and an art authentication firm that worked with several major California museums. The coins went to a numismatic grading service with documented provenance and a chain of custody that Nora insisted on establishing formally, with Amara's help, before anything left the property. The documents were the most complex, the personal papers, the letters and certificates, and records that had belonged to the families of the labor community, required careful cross-referencing with historical records to establish their origins. Dr. Marsh undertook this process as part of her own scholarly work, with Nora's consent and involvement, driven by both professional interest and what Nora had come to recognize as a genuine commitment to doing this right, for Nora was present for every step she could be present for. She drove to Los Angeles twice, to the conservation studio where the paintings were being examined, and stood in a bright, clean room and watched specialists in white gloves look at the small oil studies with instruments and lights while explaining what they were seeing. She asked questions. She took notes. She learned more about paint chemistry and canvas dating and provenance research in those weeks than she had known existed to learn. The first confirmation came in late April, an email from the Authentication firm, formal and careful in its language, but unambiguous in its conclusion. 4 of the 7 paintings were confirmed as works by the artist, bearing all the technical and stylistic markers consistent with his known body of work and the specific period of his California residence. The other 3 were under continued examination, but preliminary assessment was positive. Nora read the email at the kitchen table in the early morning, before Lily was awake, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. 4 confirmed, potentially 7. She sat with this for a long time. Then she got up and went to the back room and stood in front of the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa. Not the painting, the original photograph in its frame on the shelf. 4, she said aloud, as though reporting to someone. The photograph held its expressions. Rosa laughing, Cecilia steady. Nora nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Okay. The coin grading results arrived in early May, for Bill Okafor had been right about the 1927 D. Of the 23 coins in the cedar box, 2 were identified as 1927 D, St. Gaudens double eagles, among the rarest American gold coins in existence, produced at the Denver Mint in extremely limited numbers and largely melted down under Roosevelt's 1933 executive order. The ones that survived were mostly in private collections and were extraordinarily valuable. The grading report came with an estimated value range. Even at the conservative end of the range, for the 2 rare coins alone, The number was enough to make Nora sit down in the chair in the back room and look at it for a very long time. She had been careful through all of this about numbers. She understood that authenticated value and realized value were not the same thing, that turning objects into money required decisions and processes and time. She had not allowed herself to spend the numbers in her mind, to furnish the future with them before they were real. But even so, she sat in the chair and looked at the grading report and thought about the apartment in Fresno. The broken couch. Spring. The electricity shut off on the same Tuesday the letter arrived. The careful calculation of what remained in savings and whether it would reach the next month. She thought about Lily, who had stopped asking. She put the report down on her knee and looked at the ceiling of the small room and closed her eyes. The thing she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than triumph. It was the particular feeling of being held, of having been held, without knowing it, and by people who had done their careful work long before you existed, who had trusted the future with something precious, and of understanding, now, that you were the future they had trusted. She was the answer to a question asked in 1943. She opened her eyes. The room was the same small room it had always been. The shelves with their glass jars and old tools, the bare bulb, the narrow window where the light came in at a particular angle in the late morning, the photograph on the shelf, everything exactly as it had been, and completely, irrevocably changed. She picked up her phone and called Lily in from the yard, where she'd been reading on the porch in the May warmth. Lily came to the doorway of the back room and looked at her mother. Nora held up the grading report, and she said, "I need to tell you some numbers." Lily came in and sat on the floor beside her mother's chair and listened with complete attention, the way she listened to things that mattered, while Nora explained what the coins were worth, what it meant, and what they were going to do next. When she finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are we going to be okay?" Nora looked at her daughter, at the 9-year-old who had adapted to every difficult thing with a grace that Nora knew she herself had not always managed, who had sat close when her mother was dealing with something large, who had said, "We came here to protect something. Us. Our future." "Yes," Nora said, with a certainty she had not possessed in 2 years. "We are going to be okay." Lily leaned against her mother's leg. Outside, and the May fields were green, and the almond orchards had fruited past their bloom, and the long Central Valley light lay golden across everything, across the barn, and the fence line, and the 4 acres that had waited, and the house that was theirs. "Good," Lily said, simply, finally, with the relief of a child who has been carrying something heavy and has just been allowed to set it down. Nora put her hand on her daughter's head, and they sat together in the small room while the afternoon moved around them, and the photograph of 2 young women in summer 1943 held its expressions on the shelf, and the crate sat empty now of everything but the ghost of wax and oilcloth and 80 years of careful faith. The word got out the way words always get out in small towns. Not all at once, not with announcement, but in the particular way of things that cannot be entirely contained, leaking first through the edges, then spreading until the shape of it was visible to everyone even before the details were. It started with Dale Hutchins at the hardware store. He had seen the cars at Nora's property on that Saturday in March, including Dr. Marsh's vehicle, which was from a university, the parking sticker visible. He mentioned it to someone, who mentioned it to someone else. By the following week, the general understanding in Arvin was that something had happened at the old Reyes place, though no one knew exactly what. Amara's thesis advisor had spoken to a colleague at a museum in Sacramento, not indiscreetly, but in the way that people in specialized fields speak about significant discoveries, and with the implicit assumption that such things eventually become known. The colleague had mentioned it to someone on a grant committee. The grant committee person had a connection to a regional newspaper in Bakersfield. The article, when it appeared, was careful and preliminary. A potential significant discovery of lost artworks and historical materials in the estate of a Central Valley woman, it said. Authentication ongoing. The estate, inherited by a Fresno resident now living on the Arvin property, had contained items of historical and artistic value, believed to date from the early 1940s. It did not name Nora by name, but it named the town and the property and the general nature of what had been found. And in Arvin, everyone knew exactly who lived at the old Reyes place. Nora read the article on her phone on a Thursday morning in late April, standing in the barn where she'd been measuring for a repair she wanted to make to the east wall. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and stood for a moment in the barn, looking at the light coming through the gaps in the boards, the same light that had always come through, unchanged by anything that had happened. She thought about what came next. She was not afraid of it. She had been preparing in her quiet way for weeks. She had spoken with an attorney, a different one from Whitmore, one who specialized in art law and estate matters, and had been recommended by Dr. Marsh. She understood her position legally. She understood what she owned, and what decisions were hers to make, and what processes existed, and what her rights were within them. She was not afraid, but she was aware that the quiet period was ending, and that what came next would require a different kind of steadiness than patching roofs and washing floors. She went back to the house and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, and thought about what her grandmother Rosa would have done, which was probably exactly what Nora was going to do. Take her time, do it right, and not be moved by other people's urgency. Marco called that afternoon. She had been expecting the call since the article. She knew how Marco worked, methodical and slightly delayed, needing time to process before he acted. He would have read the article, thought about it, discussed it with Renata, and then called. "I saw the news," he said when she answered. "I know," she said. A pause. "Is it true? What they're saying?" "The article is accurate as far as it goes. The authentication isn't complete yet, but preliminary results are strong." Another pause. Longer. She could hear him working out what to say. Marco, who liked to be practical, and who had stood in her empty apartment in December, with his hands in his pockets, expressing careful concern. "Nora," he said finally, "I need you to know that I'm—" He stopped, started again. "When I said you should talk to a realtor. When I said, sell it." Marco. "I was wrong. I was being—" He stopped again. "I didn't understand what you were doing." "You were being practical," she said without edge. "You were trying to protect me from a bad decision." "I didn't believe in it." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The silence between them was not hostile. Wide was the silence of siblings who have known each other long enough to have shorthand for the complicated things. "I'd like to come see it," he said, "if that's all right. The property, the house." "Come whenever you want," she said. "The guest room isn't ready yet, but we can set up the sleeping pad." A small exhale of something that might have been a laugh. "Renata will want to come too." "Of course she will. She's—" Another pause. She feels badly about some things she said. "Tell her not to," Nora said. "Tell her to just come." After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. She did not feel triumph about the call. She had imagined, in the abstract way that people imagine vindication when they are in the middle of hard things, that there would be satisfaction in this kind of moment, in being right, and having the people who doubted her come back with the evidence of her vindication in their hands. But sitting in the kitchen of the house she'd fixed with her own hands, with the fields outside and the barn she was repairing, and the 4 acres that had yielded their 80-year secret, what she felt wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter, more like completion, like a circle that had always been meant to close. She got up and went to the window and looked at the land. "I know," she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to 2 young women in a summer photograph. "I know." The calls and visitors came steadily through April and May. Some were expected. Dr. Marsh coordinating the next steps of the authentication process. The art law attorney, whose name was Patricia Osei, walking her through the options she had regarding the paintings and what various choices might mean financially and legally and historically. The coin grading service with their results. The conservation specialist in Los Angeles with updates on the condition assessments. Some were less expected. A representative from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art called, through proper channels, to express the museum's interest in the collection and to ask whether Nora would be open to a conversation. Nora said she would be open to a conversation. She wrote this down in the notebook she had started keeping for exactly this purpose, careful and systematic, the same quality of attention she had brought to learning how to patch a roof. A reporter from a larger newspaper in Los Angeles called. Nora said she wasn't giving interviews yet. The reporter asked if she could call back in a few weeks. Nora said perhaps. A woman named Esperanza Fuentes called from a number with a 559 area code, the Central Valley. She was 93 years old, and her daughter was speaking for her, translating between Spanish and English in a patient rhythm. She said her mother's family had been in Arvin in the 1940s. She said her mother remembered Cecilia Reyes. She said her mother had been told, by her own mother before she died, that some papers had been given to Cecilia for safekeeping, documents from their family, a marriage certificate, and letters. She said her mother had always wondered what had happened to them. Nora held the phone very carefully during this call. She said, "I think I may have your family's papers." The sound from the other end of the line was something Nora would carry for a long time. Not words, just a sound. The particular sound of a very old woman who has been wondering about something for most of her life and has just been told that the wondering is over. This was the call that settled something for Nora that had still been in motion, the decisions she'd been circling about what to do with the collection, about what was hers and what was a custodianship, about the difference between an inheritance and a trust. Those decisions clarified after this call with a quiet finality. She called Patricia Osei that evening and told her what she'd decided. The decisions she made in those weeks were not simple, but they were, once made, clear. The personal documents and family papers would be returned, wherever possible, to the families they had come from or to their descendants. Amara, whose thesis had transformed into something larger and more urgent than she'd initially planned, was coordinating this process with the help of several historical societies and community organizations in the Central Valley. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing names and dates and family histories, but it was moving forward, and with each document returned, there was a call or a visit or a letter that added another layer to Nora's understanding of what Cecilia and Rosa had done in 1943. The journal, after extensive discussion with Dr. Marsh and Patricia and Amara, and in a long conversation over the kitchen table with herself, would be donated to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, which held the most significant collection of California labor history in the country. It would be preserved, digitized, and made available to researchers. Cecilia's name and Rosa's name would be on the donation record. The story of the network they had been part of would become part of the official historical record. This felt right. This felt like what the journal had been written for. The paintings were the most complex decision, and the one Nora thought about the longest. She had options. She could sell them outright, through an established auction house, or through a private sale, and the numbers Patricia had given her for this possibility were numbers that would change her life and Lily's life in every material sense. She could donate them to a museum and accept the tax implications and the recognition that came with that. She could loan them to institutions on a long-term basis while retaining ownership. What she ultimately decided was a combination of things that Patricia said she hadn't seen before, but that she understood once Nora explained it. 3 of the paintings would go to a long-term loan arrangement with 2 museums, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and a smaller regional museum in the Central Valley, whose collection focused specifically on agricultural community history. The loan agreement specified that the paintings would always be displayed in the context of their provenance, the communities they depicted, the women who had preserved them, the network that had operated in the margins of 1943. 2 paintings would be sold through a private arrangement Patricia negotiated with a collector whose collection focused on Mexican-American art history. The price negotiated was significant. It was the kind of number that, from when Nora finally wrote it down and looked at it in the kitchen with the lamp on, required several minutes of quiet sitting before she could think past it. The painting of Cecilia and Rosa would not be sold, loaned, or donated. It would stay in the house, in the room where it had waited. When Patricia asked if she was sure, Nora said yes without hesitation. "It belongs here," she said. "It was made here. It waited here. It stays here." Patricia had paused on the phone. Then she said, "All right. I think that's right, actually." The coins were the most straightforwardly material decision, and in some ways, the simplest. The 2 rare 1927 D double eagles went to auction through a reputable numismatic auction house, with full documentation of their provenance, which itself became part of their value and their story. The remaining 21 coins were sold through a grading service, their values established and realized. When the final accounting was done, Patricia sent Nora a summary document that Nora read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in June, which was, she noted, without being sure why it mattered, exactly 8 months after the Tuesday, the electricity had been shut off and the letter had arrived. She read the document through twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept important papers, next to the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa and the attorney's original letter and the card from the crate, which she had kept in her wallet since March and which she took out now and read again. For the family. Do not open until it reaches the right hands. 1943. She put it back in the drawer. She closed the drawer. Then she went to the window and looked at the land. What the money made possible was not dramatic in the way that money in stories is usually dramatic. There was no single moment of grand expenditure or visible transformation. Instead, there was a series of smaller decisions that accumulated, the way repairs do, each one building on the last, each one making the next one possible. She paid off the remaining obligations on the property. She established a proper financial account with a bank and a financial advisor Patricia recommended, someone who specialized in working with people who had come into unexpected funds and who understood that such transitions required care and patience, not haste. She hired a contractor to complete the repairs the house still needed, the structural work she hadn't been able to do herself, the rewiring that required a licensed electrician, the plumbing upgrades that the old pipes could no longer defer. She did not move out during the work. She stayed in the house while it was repaired around her, living alongside the process the way she had lived alongside everything else. She fixed the barn properly. She had plans for the barn. She took Lily shopping for school clothes, real shopping, not the careful navigation of clearance racks and price tags. Lily, who had her mother's practical nature, chose sensibly and without excess, and did not comment on the difference from before. But Nora saw something in her daughter's face that afternoon that she recognized as the relaxing of a vigilance that a 9-year-old should not have needed to maintain. See, she set aside a fund for Lily's education, enough to cover any reasonable version of the future Lily chose, enough that the question of college and opportunity would be answered by ability and interest rather than by money. She did this first, before most other things, because some priorities are not complicated. She called Dolores and told her she was hiring her, if Dolores wanted, to help manage the property and develop what Nora had been thinking about for the barn. Dolores, who had been working hotel housekeeping for 11 years and who had a talent for organization that the hotel had never properly recognized or compensated, said yes before Nora finished the sentence. The idea for the barn had been developing since February, and since the morning she'd found the carving on the workbench and begun to understand the full dimension of what Cecilia and Rosa had done. It had grown slowly, the way real ideas grow, adding details and shape over months of thinking, until by summer it was concrete enough to act on. She was going to turn the barn into a community archive and gathering space, not a museum exactly, though some elements of what she envisioned were museum-like. More of a living repository, a place where the history of the agricultural communities of the Central Valley could be preserved and accessed and shared, with particular attention to the stories and contributions of the women and families who had done the invisible work of keeping things alive. Amara's thesis had become something larger under the pressure of the discovery, a book project now, on with a university press interested, telling the story of the preservation network that Cecilia and Rosa had been part of, and the broader pattern of community safeguarding that the historical record, once you knew to look for it, showed operating across the region in the 1940s. The archive would be the physical home for this work, and for the work that would follow it. Dr. Marsh, when Nora told her about the plan, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to help with this, not as a consultant, as a participant." Bill Okafor, when Nora told him, said, "My father kept records, from the community. I always wondered what to do with them." Esperanza Fuentes, 93 years old, came to see the property in July with her daughter and her granddaughter, 3 generations in a car that pulled up the dirt road that Nora had had properly graded and graveled by then. She walked slowly with a cane, but walked without assistance, and she stood in the yard of the house and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, in Spanish, which her daughter translated softly, "I remember this house. I came here with my mother when I was a girl. Cecilia Reyes made us tamales." She paused. She was a serious woman, but she laughed when she thought you weren't paying attention. Nora looked at the photograph in her mind, Cecilia steady-eyed in the summer sun. "I've seen that," she said. Esperanza looked at her, sharp old eyes, the kind that have been paying attention for 9 decades and show it. "You're Rosa's," she said, a statement, not a question. "Her granddaughter," Nora said. Esperanza nodded slowly. "She would like this," she said. "What you're doing here. She would like that it came back to family." They returned the Fuentes family papers that afternoon, the marriage certificate, 3 letters in a neat hand that Esperanza's daughter read aloud in the kitchen, while Esperanza sat at the table and listened with her eyes closed. When the reading was done, there was a silence in the kitchen that was full rather than empty, the kind of silence that comes after something long incomplete has been finished. Lily, who had been sitting on the stairs listening, came down afterward and sat beside Esperanza at the table and asked, with the directness that was becoming one of her defining characteristics, what it was like to be 93. Esperanza looked at her. Then she laughed, a full and genuine laugh that filled the kitchen. "Slow," she said in English, "but worth it." Marco and Renata came in August. They drove down on a Saturday morning and arrived to find Nora on the newly repaired porch drinking coffee, the house behind her freshly painted in a warm ochre that the contractor had called a California color and that Nora had chosen because it looked right against the land. The barn was visible beyond the house, its doors open to the summer air, Dolores inside arranging shelving with the focused competence she brought to all organizational tasks. Marco got out of the car and stood looking at the property for a long moment. Then he looked at his sister. She let him look. She understood what he was seeing, the difference between what this place had been in December and what it was now. The repaired fence, the graded road, the house that stood with the quiet dignity of something properly cared for. The fields, green with a summer cover crop she'd planted to rebuild the soil for whatever she decided to do with the land the following year. "Nora," he said. His voice had something in it she didn't often hear from Marco, something unguarded. "It's good, right?" she said. He nodded slowly. "It's good." Renata came around the car and looked at the house, and then at Nora, and Nora saw on her sister-in-law's face the particular expression of a woman who is working out how to apologize without quite having the words for it, which was not a thing Renata often had to do, and which therefore presented a certain difficulty. Nora came down from the porch and hugged her, which resolved the difficulty. "Come see the barn," she said. "Well, I'll tell you what I'm doing with it." They spent the day. Dolores fed them, because Dolores had opinions about hospitality and the resources now to act on them. Lily showed her uncle the painting of Cecilia and Rosa, walking him through the back room with the proprietary pride of someone who has been part of something significant and knows it. Marco stood in front of the painting for a long time, and Nora watched his face move through something she chose not to name, because some things are more honest when they're private. In the afternoon, they sat on the porch, all of them, with the valley spread before them and the summer light long and gold across everything. And Nora told them the whole story. Not the version she'd been telling in pieces and fragments, but the whole thing, and from the letter to the drive to Bakersfield, to the sagging porch, to the 14 hours of roofing videos, to the back room and the wax seal and the paintings and the coins and the journal and Esperanza Fuentes at the kitchen table. When she finished, Marco was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Rosa, our grandmother, she did this. She and Cecilia, together. She never talked about it. My mother never mentioned. I don't think she told anyone," Nora said. "I think that was the point. If you tell people where you've hidden things, they're not hidden." Marco sat with this. The practical man, the insurance man, the man who said sell it and call a realtor, working through the logic of a woman who had lived and died decades before he was born, and who had made a decision in 1943 that had carried forward through time to his sister sitting on a porch in Arvin with a restored house and a repaired barn and a future that looked different from any future he'd imagined for her. She trusted the future, Marco said finally, not quite a question. She trusted someone in the future, Nora said. She trusted that eventually someone would come who needed what she'd kept, and who would know what to do with it. Renata had been quiet for most of this. Now she said carefully, "And you knew what to do with it." "I'm learning," Nora said. "I'm still learning." Renata looked at the fields, at the barn, at her husband's face, which was doing something she clearly found significant, at Nora, sitting in her chair, on her porch, on her land. "No," Renata said quietly. "I think you knew." Dale Hutchins came by the hardware store later that month, which is to say, Nora went to the hardware store, and Dale was there, as he always was, with his opinions and his certainty and his 60 years of local knowledge. He rang up her purchases without his usual commentary. She was almost to the door when he said, behind her, "Heard about what you found." She turned. He was looking at the counter rather than at her, which for Dale was a form of respect. "Heard you're doing something with the barn. For the community." "That's right," she said. He nodded. A long nod. Processing. "My wife's family went back to the 1930s in this valley," he said. "Agricultural. Not the same situation as you know, but same period." "I know," she said. She kept some things. Photos, papers. She always said she didn't know what to do with them. Nora looked at him. "Tell her to bring them by," she said. "That's exactly what the archive is for." He looked up then, not with the hum of assessment or the hum of skepticism, with something else. "All right," he said. "I'll tell her." He went back to the counter. Nora went to her car. She sat in the parking lot for a moment and thought about the way things change, not all at once, not with dramatic reversal, but by accumulation, by the slow addition of moments that each move slightly in the right direction until the direction has changed entirely. She drove home. The article that appeared in October, 1 year almost exactly after the letter arrived, was a different kind of article from the preliminary one in April. It was long, careful, reported over several months by a journalist who had spoken with Nora and Dr. Marsh and Amara and Esperanza Fuentes' family, and several historians, and Patricia Osei and Bill Okafor, and Dale Hutchins's wife, whose name was Linda, and who had indeed brought photographs. The article told the full story, not just the discovery, but everything around it. The network of women in 1943, the communities they had served, the deliberate and skillful act of preservation they had undertaken, the 80 years of waiting, and the woman who had come to the property with her daughter and fixed the roof with her own hands and waited for the right moment and opened what had been kept for her. It told the story of Rosa, of the painting, of Esperanza at the kitchen table with the letters from her mother, of the archive in the barn and what it was becoming. So Nora read it at the kitchen table, which was her location for reading important things, with Lily beside her. They read it together, passing Nora's phone back and forth, reading the parts aloud that seemed to warrant reading aloud, which was most of it. When they finished, Lily said, "They got it right." "Mostly," Nora said. "What did they get wrong?" Nora thought about it. "They said I drove to Bakersfield with hope," she said. "I don't think that's quite right. I drove with almost no gas money, and a child, and a broken car, and I didn't know if any of it would work." "That's what hope is, though," Lily said. "Isn't it? Going when you don't know." Nora looked at her daughter. At 10 now, a grade ahead, well, with 2 friends who had become 4, and a teacher who had said at the last conference that Lily had one of the most remarkable minds she'd encountered in 30 years of teaching, which was the kind of thing that could not be said without certain implications for the future. "Yes," Nora said, "I think that's what hope is." In November, the archive had its first proper opening event. Not a grand opening with ribbon cutting and speeches, which was not Nora's style and would not have suited the barn, but a gathering, the way the community had been gathering in that valley for generations, with food and music and people standing in the space and looking at what had been put on the walls. The walls held photographs, historical photographs of the agricultural communities of the Central Valley in the 1940s, and several of which had been found in the Crates document collection, others donated by families who had heard about the archive and brought what they had kept. Among them, enlarged and framed, the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa, 2 young women in summer, one laughing, one steady. Beneath it, a card in the careful small typeface that Amara had helped Nora choose for the archive's documentation style. Cecilia Reyes and Rosa Guerrero. Arvin, summer 1943. Founders of the Central Valley Women's Preservation Network, custodians of this collection. Nora stood in front of it for a long time that evening, in the barn full of people, and lamplight, and the smell of food, and the sound of conversations in Spanish and English, and sometimes both at once. Dolores appeared at her shoulder with a plate of something and said, Anna quietly, "You did this." "They did this," Nora said. "I just found it. You came here. You stayed. You did the work. You opened it at the right time in the right way. And you did everything after that right, too." Dolores paused. "Don't do that thing where you take yourself out of your own story." Nora looked at her. "You are in this story," Dolores said. "You're not just the person it happened to. You're one of the people who made it happen." Nora looked at the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa. She thought about the card on the crate, the right hands. She thought about a Tuesday in October, 1 year ago, electricity off, letter in her hand, small seed in her chest. She thought about the 14 hours of roofing videos, the sleeping pad on the floor. The morning Lily had stood in the pale winter light and said it's kind of beautiful. The carving on the workbench, the sound of the wax seal breaking, the smell when the lid came off, Rosa's face in a painting made in summer 1943 in the yard of this property. She thought about Lily saying, "That's like faith." She thought about Esperanza laughing in the kitchen. She thought about the drawer where she kept the card, for the family. Do not open until it reaches the right hands. She was in this story. She had always been in this story. The story had been waiting for her specifically, waiting for someone who would come with nothing and stay with everything, who would do the work without knowing the outcome, who would honor the keeping by continuing it. "Okay," she said to Dolores, quietly, meaning more than the word held. "Good," Dolores said, and gave her the plate. The school principal came to the archive opening. Her name was Deborah Winslow, and she was a tall, composed woman in her 50s who had been running Arvin's elementary school for 14 years and who had a reputation for being fair and measured and not given to sentiment. She had been among the first people in town to learn that Lily was a remarkable student. She had not, until this evening, spoken more than briefly and politely to Nora. She found Nora near the back of the barn, standing with a group of older community members looking at a display of photographs from the 1940s labor camps. She waited until the group had dispersed before she approached. "Mrs. Vásquez," she said. "Nora," Nora said. "Nora." She paused, in the way of a woman choosing her words with more care than usual. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I think that's more respectful than dressing it up." Nora waited. "When you enrolled Lily in September, there were some conversations among the staff about the family situation, about whether you would stay, whether the enrollment would last." She paused. "I want to be honest. I shared some of those concerns. I wondered whether it was worth investing in building a relationship with your daughter, given what I understood about the circumstances." She stopped, looked at the photographs on the wall rather than at Nora. "I was wrong about the circumstances, obviously. But more than that, I was wrong to make those calculations at all. A child deserves to be invested in regardless of her mother's financial situation." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Lily is remarkable," Principal Winslow continued. "She was remarkable in September when I was making those calculations, and she is remarkable now. That didn't change. I was just more willing to see it once I thought your situation had changed." "I appreciate you saying that," Nora said, and she meant it, without warmth, but without coldness either. The plain acknowledgement of a plain thing said plainly. "I'm going to do better," Principal Winslow said. "I have several other students in similar situations to where Lily was. I'm going to look at them differently." Nora looked at her. "That's the right thing," she said. Principal Winslow nodded once, the nod of someone who has done a hard thing and will now get on with the rest of the evening, and moved toward the refreshment table. Nora turned back to the photographs on the wall, and she thought about all the children who had sat in classrooms while adults made quiet calculations about whether they were worth the investment. She thought about Lily, who had stopped asking for things, and about all the children who had learned the same lesson and were still learning it. She made a note, in the part of her mind she had developed for this purpose, of a conversation she would have with Patricia Osei next week, about a scholarship, about what it might look like, about what it was possible to do with resources when the instinct was not to accumulate, but to forward. The woman who arrived unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon in late September was someone Nora did not recognize at first. She drove a late-model sedan and wore the careful, the coordinated clothing of someone who had thought about what to wear before leaving the house. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of composed presentation that Nora had learned to read as effortful rather than natural. She knocked on the front door while Nora was in the barn, and Dolores, who had heard the car, went to answer it. By the time Nora came in from the barn, the woman was standing in the front room, looking at the photographs on the wall, the framed copies of the historical photographs Nora had begun to put up throughout the house as the archive developed. Dolores was in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed, in the position she adopted when she was reserving judgment. "I'm Sandra Kemper," the woman said when Nora came in. "My father was Gerald Kemper. He owned the property before Cecilia Reyes." Nora was still. The name meant nothing to her from the legal history, but the framing of it, the way she said before Cecilia Reyes, with a faint emphasis that suggested prior claim, told her something about what this visit was. "Nora Vásquez," she said. "What can I do for you?" Sandra Kemper looked at the room, at the repaired walls, the warm paint, the photographs, the general evidence of a house that had been reclaimed from neglect and turned into something. Her expression was composed, but not entirely comfortable. "I want to be straightforward," she said. "Please," Nora said. "My father sold this property to Cecilia Reyes in 1978. He sold it cheaply because it needed work, and because Cecilia was insistent, and because my father was not, at that time, in a position to manage it himself." She paused. He always felt he'd made a bad deal. He talked about it for years, how that property had value that he hadn't recognized. Nora waited. When the articles came out, about the paintings, the coins, she stopped, recalibrated. "My father passed away 4 years ago, but my brother saw the articles. He thought—" Another stop. "He thought there might be a claim on some of the contents based on the original sale." Nora looked at her steadily. "I told him there wasn't," Sandra Kemper said. "I looked into it. The property sold with its contents to Cecilia Reyes legally and completely in 1978. The crate predates the sale by 35 years. There is no claim." She paused. "I told him that, and then I thought about whether to come here at all, and I decided I should, because I didn't want you to hear from my brother's direction without hearing from mine first." Nora considered this. The woman in front of her had driven out here, unannounced, on a Wednesday, to tell her in person that she was not going to be pursued by a legal challenge that had no merit. That was, when she thought about it plainly, a more decent thing than it might first appear. "I appreciate that," Nora said. "My brother is not a bad person," Sandra said. "He just saw a number and thought about what his father had always said, about the bad deal." She looked at the wall of photographs again, at the framed picture of Cecilia and Rosa. "But looking at this," she stopped. "My father sold it cheaply because he didn't take care of it. Cecilia kept it when he couldn't, or wouldn't. And now," she gestured at the room, at the house, at the implication of everything beyond it. "You came here, and you did what nobody else had been willing to do." "I didn't know what was here," Nora said. "Not when I came." "No," Sandra Kemper said. "You came anyway." There was a pause between them, not hostile, not entirely comfortable, but honest in the specific way of two people who have just been truthful with each other about something that could have gone differently. "There's an opening event for the archive in November," Nora said. "If you want to come, it's open to the community." Sandra Kemper looked at her, and something in her face shifted into something less composed and more real. "I'd like that," she said. "I think I'd like to understand what this place is becoming." She left. Dolores emerged fully from the kitchen doorway, having apparently decided that the situation no longer required standing guard. Dolores said. Nora agreed. "You didn't have to invite her." "I know. But you did." "She drove out here to tell me she wasn't going to cause me trouble," Nora said. "That took something. The least I could do was offer her a door." Dolores considered this. Then she nodded, slowly, the nod she reserved for things she'd decided Nora had gotten right. "Rosa would have done that," she said. Nora looked at the photograph on the wall. Cecilia steady, Rosa laughing. "Yes," she said. "I think she would." The last vindication came quietly, the way the most complete ones usually do. It came in the form of a letter, handwritten, delivered in an envelope with a Fresno return address she didn't recognize. The handwriting was elderly, deliberate, and the pen pressed firmly, as if the writer wanted to be sure every word landed. She opened it at the kitchen table on a gray November morning, the kind of morning where the valley fog sits low and the light comes in diffused and soft through the windows. The letter was from a woman named Gloria Medina, 78 years old, who introduced herself as a woman who had worked alongside Nora's mother at a hotel in Fresno for 11 years. A woman Nora had not met, but whose name, once read, she recognized from her mother's occasional stories. Gloria wrote that she had seen the articles about Nora and the crate. She wrote that she had thought about writing for several months before she did, because she was not sure what to say and wanted to say it right. She wrote that she remembered Nora's mother talking about Nora, about the divorce, about the hard years, about the worry. She wrote that she remembered a specific conversation in the break room of the hotel, where Nora's mother had said, in the way of a mother trying to manage her own fear, "I don't know what's going to happen to her. She's so stubborn. She won't ask for help. She just keeps going like she can outlast anything." Gloria wrote, "I thought about that when I read about you, about how you went to that property when anyone sensible would have sold it, about how you stayed and fixed it with your hands and waited to open that crate until you felt the time was right. I thought, her mother was right. She does keep going like she can outlast anything. And it turns out she was right too." She wrote, "I am writing because I wanted someone who knew your mother to tell you that she would be so proud, not because of the money, though I think she would be relieved about the money. Your mother worried about the money every day I knew her. But because of how you did it, because of the kind of woman you turned out to be, the stubborn kind, the kind that outlasts." Nora read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and held it with both hands against her chest, the way she had held the letter from the attorney a year ago on a Tuesday when the electricity was off. Different letter. Different Tuesday. The same pair of hands. She sat at the kitchen table in the house that was hers, on the land that had been kept for her by people who trusted the future, and she let the thing move through her that had been trying to move through her for a year, all the years before that too, the grief and the effort and the fear and the love and the long accumulated weight of a life lived at the edge of what was manageable, and she let it move through her entirely, and then she was on the other side of it. From Lily's room, the sound of her getting ready for school, shoes on the floor, a drawer opening and closing, the small, ordinary sounds of a morning in a house where someone is loved and safe and not afraid. Nora wiped her face with the back of her hand. She put the letter in the drawer with the others, with the card from the crate and the photograph and the attorney's letter and her own letter to Cecilia and Rosa. The drawer that had become, without her quite deciding it, the place where she kept the things that mattered most. She closed the drawer. She stood up. She went to the window and looked at the fields and the barn and the 4 acres and the gray morning light beginning to open into something clearer. Then she called to Lily that breakfast was ready, and she went to the stove and began. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, after Dr. Marsh had left with her camera full of documentation and a promise to begin the authentication process, after Amara had driven away with a list of sources to pursue and barely suppressed scholarly elation, after Bill Okafor had shaken Nora's hand at the fence line with the quiet gravity of a man who has witnessed something and knows it, after Dolores had hugged her in the kitchen for a long moment and driven back to Fresno, Nora and Lily were alone in the house. They made dinner together, the two of them moving around the kitchen with the easy coordination of people who have shared a small space for months and learned each other's rhythms. Lily set the table. Nora cooked. The house smelled of cumin and garlic and warm tortillas, and the evening light came through the window above the sink at a low angle and caught the steam from the pot. After dinner, Lily asked if they could look at the painting again, the one of Cecilia and Rosa. They went to the back room together. The objects from the crate had been carefully replaced in their oilcloth wrappings and set on the clean shelf Dr. Marsh had recommended, pending proper conservation storage. The paintings were laid flat, each documented and tagged. The cedar box with the coins was closed and wrapped. The journal sat separately, also wrapped, waiting. Nora unwrapped the painting of the two women carefully and held it where the light could reach it. She and Lily stood in the small room and looked at it together. Rosa, 22 years old, laughing at something beyond the edge of the world that had been captured here. Cecilia, steady-eyed and composed, looking at the painter with an expression that Nora now understood differently than she had before. Not just composure. Knowing. The expression of someone who is already thinking about what comes after this moment, about the future she intends to protect. "She looks like you," Lily said. Nora looked at Rosa's laughing face, the shape of the jaw, the line of the cheekbone. "You think?" "The way she's laughing, you laugh like that sometimes, when you forget to be serious." Nora looked at her daughter. "You should do that more," Lily said, or with the directness of a 9-year-old who has decided that this is an important thing to say. "Forget to be serious." "We're going to have more reasons to," Nora said. Lily thought about this. Because of the crate? Because of the crate. Because of what's in it. Because of what it means. She paused. Because we came here, and we stayed, and we did the work, and we were the right hands. We were, Lily agreed, without false modesty, because it was simply true. Nora wrapped the painting carefully and set it back. She turned off the shelf light, and they went back to the kitchen, where the dishes were waiting. They washed them together, Lily washing and Nora drying, the old radio on the windowsill playing something low and steady. The house was warm. The fields outside were dark and quiet. In the back room, the objects waited in their careful wrappings, patient as they had always been. 80 years of patience having apparently been sufficient preparation for a little more. Lo que guardamos vive. In November, the archive had its first proper opening event. Not a grand opening with ribbon cutting and speeches, which was not Nora's style and would not have suited the barn, but a gathering, the way the community had been gathering in that valley for generations, with food and music and people standing in the space and looking at what had been put on the walls. The walls held photographs, historical photographs of the agricultural communities of the Central Valley in the 1940s, several of which had been found in the crate's document collection, others donated by families who had heard about the archive and brought what they had kept. On among them, enlarged and framed, the photograph of Cecilia and Rosa, two young women in summer, one laughing, one steady. Beneath it, a card in the careful small typeface that Amara had helped Nora choose for the archive's documentation style. Cecilia Reyes and Rosa Guerrero. Arvin. Summer 1943. Founders of the Central Valley Women's Preservation Network. Custodians of this collection. Later that evening, after most people had gone and the barn was being tidied by Dolores with her characteristic efficiency, Nora found Lily in the back corner of the archive space, sitting on a low bench in front of a display case. Inside the case was the cedar box, empty now of its coins, but preserved as an artifact, and beside it several of the photographs from the collection, and on a small stand, open to a particular page, a facsimile of the journal. The original was at the Bancroft, properly preserved. The facsimile was here, where people could see it. The page it was open to was in Rosa's hand, the bolder, slightly irregular script that had added its line below Cecilia's careful inscription. "Y lo que guardamos vive." Lily was reading it. Nora sat beside her on the bench. "What does it mean exactly?" Lily asked. She knew, but she was asking for the precision of it. "What we keep lives," Nora said. Lily looked at the words for a moment. Do you think she knew it would work? That someone would actually come and find it? Nora thought about Rosa, about the faith required to seal something in a crate in 1943 and trust it to time. Not the faith that says, "I believe this will be fine." The other kind. The harder kind. The faith that says, "I do not know if this will work, but I do it anyway, because it is the right thing to do, and the future deserves to be trusted even when trust is difficult." "I think she hoped," Nora said. "I don't think she knew. But she did it anyway." Lily looked at the words in her great-grandmother's handwriting. "Like us," she said. "Coming here." "Like us," Nora agreed. They sat together in the quiet of the barn, the lamplight warm around them, the sound of the last conversations fading as people moved to their cars, and the November night settled into the valley outside. Through the open barn door, the fields were dark, and the stars were beginning to appear. The same stars that had turned above this land for all of the 80 years and more, that the crate had waited, indifferent and constant and beautiful. Nora looked at her daughter's face in the lamplight, at the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, Rosa's jaw. Rosa's eyes, her mother had always said, though Nora had never known what she was comparing them to until she saw the painting. The line continued. The keeping continued. What they had received, they were already passing forward, in the archive, and the work and the story, now properly told. And in this child sitting beside her, on a bench in November, reading her great-grandmother's handwriting by lamplight. Lo que guardamos vive. What we keep lives. It was almost exactly a year after the electricity was shut off that Nora sat down at the kitchen table on a November evening and wrote a letter. She wrote it by hand because the occasion seemed to call for it. She wrote it to no one specific, or perhaps to everyone specific, to Cecilia and Rosa and Esperanza's mother and the other women of the network whose names were in the journal, to the families whose documents had been returned and the families whose documents were still being traced, to the painter who had made 7 small studies in the California morning light and given them to people who had given them to Cecilia, who had given them to time. She wrote about what the year had been, the house and the repairs and the electricity and the crate, the opening and the authentication and the decisions, the archive in the barn, the growing collection, the families who had come to find what had been kept for them, Esperanza at the kitchen table, Dale Hutchins's wife Linda bringing photographs, Dr. Marsh and Amara and Patricia and Dolores and Bill Okafor. She wrote about Lily, like about the teaching that was happening in both directions, between a woman learning to inhabit her own story and a child learning that the world is full of things worth keeping and people worth trusting with what you keep. She wrote, "I understand now what you did. Not just the crate. All of it. The decision to trust the future. The work of keeping things alive across all that distance. You didn't know who would come. But you knew someone would. Someone who needed what you'd kept, and you did the work anyway. That is the larger thing. That is the thing I am trying to learn to do." She wrote, "I think about faith a lot now. My daughter says it's going when you don't know. I think she's right. You went when you didn't know. I came here when I didn't know. The not knowing is the condition. The going is the choice." She wrote, "The painting of you is on the wall in the back room where it has always been. You are still laughing. You are still steady. I look at you every day, and I think about what you kept, and what I'm keeping, and what Lily will keep after me." She wrote, "Lo que guardamos vive." I know now what that means, not just what it translates to, what it means. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer beside the card from the crate and the photograph and the attorney's letter from a year ago. She sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the evening house. From Lily's room, the soft sound of reading, a page turning. From outside, the November wind, moving through the eucalyptus, the same sound that had been here when she arrived, the same sound that had been here in 1943. From the barn, silence, the archive sleeping, the photographs on the walls, the facsimile journal open to Rosa's line, patient and permanent. Nora sat at her kitchen table in the house that was hers, on the 4 acres that were hers, in the life that was being rebuilt from what had been kept for her, and she breathed. There are things we carry for people we haven't met yet, things we preserve against futures we can't imagine, things we seal against time and mark with the only instructions that matter, for the family, for the ones who will know what to do with it, for the right hands. Every person who has ever put something in a drawer and thought someone will need this, who has kept a letter or a photograph or a coin or a recipe or a story, who has told a child the name of a grandmother they never knew, who has gone when they didn't know, who has trusted the future with what the present couldn't hold safely, is part of this. It is ordinary. It is everywhere. It is the quiet infrastructure of everything that survives. Nora Vásquez came to Arvin, California, with $3 in gas station snacks and a daughter who had stopped asking for things, and a broken car that complained in 4th gear, and a deed to a house with a sagging porch and a crate in the back seat that had been sealed since 1943. She stayed. She worked. She waited for the right moment. And what she found was not only a fortune, though it was that. Not only a collection of artwork and historical artifacts, though it was that too. Not only the documented evidence of a network of extraordinary women operating in the margins of history, though it was certainly that. What she found was her grandmother's face in summer, her grandmother's laugh, her grandmother's faith in a future that included her. What she found was that she had been trusted, specifically, personally, across 80 years of distance, by 2 young women who could not have known her name, but who knew that someone like her would come, and who had done their careful work and sealed it with wax and marked it with a card and given it to time. She had been the right hands. She is still. What we keep, lives, and what lives, keeps. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.